Ethan Caldwell, a successful tycoon as cold as the marble of his immense mansion, lives a life full of luxury, but marked by the absence of something that not even his vast empire can provide: an heir. Sterile, bitter, and unable to truly connect with those around him, Ethan sinks into a solitary routine, distrusting everyone. His controlled and predictable existence changes forever when his housemaid, Emma Harris, saves him from a brutal robbery at the entrance to his own home. From that moment on, their fates intertwine in a mysterious and irrevocable way, culminating in a revelation that will defy the laws of science, fate, and love. Oh, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. The Caldwell Mansion, located in an isolated part of Connecticut, seemed impenetrable. Its high iron gates and security cameras gave the illusion of absolute protection, but on that grey morning, danger found a loophole. Ethan was about to leave for another day of exhausting cold meetings, where millions of dollars would be decided with a simple handshake, when his routine of absolute control was violently interrupted. The billionaire adjusted his dark suit as he descended the steps to the main entrance. The expensive watch he wore shone in the dim light of the overcast day, a status symbol that seemed to shout to the world that he was untouchable. But the truth was otherwise. Ethan was trapped in his own bubble of coldness and emptiness, a sterile man who watched his empire grow with no one to inherit it. Emma Harris, his new employee, arrived at work at the same moment. With hurried steps, she held her coat tightly against her body to protect herself from the biting wind. Her life, so far removed from the Caldwell's opulence, was a constant battle. Fleeing a past she preferred to forget, Emma tried to start again, but the shadow of what she had left behind seemed to accompany her at every turn. As she approached the gate, her attentive eyes caught something strange: a hooded figure, motionless, waiting by the gate. The man exuded a menacing energy, and Emma knew immediately that he wasn't there by chance. Ethan, distracted by his cell phone, didn't notice the danger until it was too late. The assailant quickly appeared, blocking his path and demanding everything of value he had. "Give me everything, watch, wallet, quickly," ordered the man, his voice full of aggression. Ethan froze. His eyes widened as he realized that the man was more dangerous than he looked. He tried to control his breathing, but fear began to seep through his defenses. Emma, hiding behind the low wall of the entrance, watched the scene with her heart in her throat. Every instinct inside her screamed at her to run, but something kept her there. She knew that if she didn't do something, that man could hurt Ethan. Without thinking, Emma picked up a heavy stone that lay on the ground. She emerged from her cover and shouted, "Hey, let him go now." The assailant quickly turned his face away, confused. That moment of distraction was enough for Emma to throw the stone with all her might. The impact hit the man's shoulder, and he let out a cry of pain and staggered. Ethan, still in shock, remained paralyzed while Emma ran to where the man was and faced him bravely. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes shone with determination. "Get out of here before things get worse," she shouted, her voice firm despite the fear that still pulsed in her chest. The man hesitated for a moment, but when he realized that Emma wouldn't back down, he hurried away, disappearing down the deserted street. When it was finally over, Emma dropped the stone, which hit the ground with a dry thud. Her breathing was uncontrolled, and her knees were weak. Ethan approached her slowly, his eyes still wide with shock at what had just happened. You saved me," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Emma didn't reply immediately. She closed her eyes, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to overflow. "I only did what anyone would have done, Mr. Caldwell." "Anyone?" Ethan shook his head in disbelief. "You risked your life for me." Emma's gaze met his, and for a brief moment, there was a silence filled with something deeper, something that neither of them could understand at that moment. Ethan, a man used to dealing with numbers and logic, felt something unknown in his chest. Gratitude, yes, but also a vulnerability that he had long since buried. "Are you all right?" he finally asked, trying to regain his cool posture. Emma took a deep breath before answering, "Yes, I'm fine. And you?" He nodded, although the trembling in his hands gave him away. Without saying another word, he turned and walked back to the house, leaving Emma alone in the doorway, still trying to process what had just happened. Inside the mansion, Ethan sat in the leather armchair in his living room, staring at the emptiness. For the first time in years, he felt small, human, and as much as he hated to admit it, something inside him had changed that day. The sound of Emma's footsteps echoed through the hallway as she too entered the house. She tried to regain her composure, but she knew that this moment would mark her life forever. Far from imagining the twists and turns that fate still had in store for both of them, Ethan and Emma had crossed an invisible line, one that would link their paths irreversibly. The morning that should have been just another day in the meticulously planned life of Ethan Caldwell turned into a whirlwind of emotions that he didn't know how to cope with. For the first time in years, his existence, so secure and calculated, slipped out of his control. As the clock ticked down, plans for crucial meetings in Manhattan were ignored. He cancelled everything, turning off his cell phone and leaving the business world to its own devices. Sitting in his dark leather armchair, Ethan stared into the soft fire in the fireplace of his large living room. The flames cast dancing shadows across the marble walls, but they didn't warm the coldness that had settled in his heart. He closed his eyes, trying to push the mugger's face out of his mind, but the memory of Emma plucking up the courage to face him kept coming back. She risked her life for me. He shook the glass of whiskey in his hand, his knuckles turning white. Ethan had always believed that people like Emma, his employees, ordinary people, never did more than was necessary. They came, they worked, they got their pay, and they left. But Emma shattered all his beliefs. There was something about her that disarmed him, that made him question everything. The wind outside beat against the high windows, a sound that seemed to echo the turbulence in his mind. He stood up abruptly, the ice in his glass clinking. He felt indebted. But how could a man like him repay something so human? Ethan was a master at buying solutions. A fat check would solve the problem, right? No. Something inside him knew that would be an insult. Still absorbed in his thoughts, Ethan walked towards the kitchen, feeling the stiffness of his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. As soon as he entered, his eyes landed on Emma. She had her back to him, stirring something in a pot. She wasn't wearing the uniform she usually wore, just a simple blouse and jeans, still wet from the light rain that had started minutes ago. Her clothes were modest, but at that moment, Ethan noticed something he had never noticed before. She was beautiful. Not an obvious or extravagant beauty, but something subtle, almost serene, like the glow of a star on a dark night. Her hair was still damp, a few strands stuck to her neck. Her movements were delicate but firm, as if each gesture had a purpose. Ethan stood in the doorway watching her in silence until the sound of the fire in the stove brought up a painful memory. For an instant, he remembered his ex-wife, Claire, the only person he had ever truly loved, or so he believed. Claire used to cook for him when things were still good between them, before they discovered that Ethan was incapable of having children. The revelation destroyed the marriage. Claire left, taking with her the only spark of warmth left in Ethan's life. Since then, he had become the cold, distant man who ran his empire with an iron fist. And now, there was Emma, a woman so far removed from that glamorous world, but who seemed to shine with a force he couldn't ignore. Mr. Caldwell. Emma's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. He realized that he had stood still for too long, staring at her. Emma turned around, holding a wooden spoon, surprised to see him there. Her dark eyes met his, and there was a vulnerability in her expression that Ethan couldn't decipher. "Are you all right?" she asked, with a genuine concern that disconcerted him. Ethan cleared his throat, trying to regain his posture. "Yes, He hesitated, something rare for him. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did today." Emma looked away, returning to stirring the contents of the pot. "No need to thank me, Mr. Caldwell. Anyone would have done the same." He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on her. "No, I wouldn't." She was silent for a few moments before sighing, as if his words carried a weight she didn't want to face. It was instinct. "I did what seemed right." Ethan continued to watch her, trying to understand the woman who had defied his logic and his expectations. Finally, he murmured, "You're different, Emma." She stopped, her back still turned to him. Something in that sentence made her take a deep breath, but she didn't respond. "I thought I'd repay you somehow," he continued, his voice lower, almost hesitant. Emma turned around slowly, her eyes analyzing him cautiously. "Give something back?" He nodded. "Yes. I want you to have something in return for risking your life for me." She let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "Mr. Caldwell, with all due respect, I didn't do this expecting something in return." Ethan stepped forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I need to do something, I have to." The sincerity in his voice disconcerted her. For a moment, Emma saw something she rarely associated with Ethan Caldwell: humanity. "If you insist." she began, but was interrupted by the loud sound of thunder outside, followed by a sudden power cut. The mansion plunged into darkness, lit only by the occasional flash of lightning that cut across the sky. Emma gasped slightly, her eyes wide as she turned to look out of the window. The storm had arrived suddenly, and the sound of the howling wind was frightening. Ethan, however, remained calm, despite the discomfort evident in his posture. "Stay here. I'll check the generator." Emma nodded, but couldn't hide her nervousness. The darkness brought up old memories that she would rather forget, a past that haunted her and which, on nights like this, seemed closer than ever. Ethan left the kitchen, and Emma was left alone, hugging herself as the thunder roared again. When Ethan returned from the engine room, the generator had restored light throughout the mansion, but the storm outside still roared, as if reflecting the internal maelstrom he couldn't control. The sound of his shoes echoed on the marble as he made his way back to the kitchen. He found Emma still there, sitting at the table with her hands folded, her gaze lost on some undefined point. Something about her seemed fragile, but there was a strength he couldn't ignore. Emma looked up when she noticed Ethan's presence. He had a firm expression, but his tone was surprisingly gentle. "The storm is getting worse," he said, nodding towards the window. "I think you should stay here until it gets better. It's not safe to drive in this weather." Emma hesitated, but nodded. "All right then. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan approached, crossing his arms and leaning against the bench. His eyes were fixed on her, as if trying to decipher something that was beyond the obvious. "But there's something else I wanted to sort out." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "About my debt to you." Emma sighed, letting out a light but tired smile. "I told you, Mr. Caldwell, I don't want anything." Ethan frowned, his determination growing. "That's not good enough for me. I can't ignore what you've done. I can't just get on with my life without doing something for you." Emma lowered her gaze for a moment, as if pondering. Finally she spoke. "If it's so important to you, so there is something, yes." Ethan straightened up, surprised. He had expected a direct and simple request, something predictable like money or some material good. "Of course, tell me what it is." Emma took a deep breath, looking almost shy as she revealed her request. "I'd like to take a Mexican cooking course." The simplicity of the request stunned him. Ethan remained motionless, staring at her. "A cooking course?" he repeated, as if he needed to process the words better. Emma nodded, her voice low but firm. "I know you like Mexican food, and I've always wanted to learn how to cook for real, especially dishes that might please you. I feel like I never do enough here." Ethan was silent for a moment. The idea seemed absurd to him, but not in a bad way. It was surreal that, faced with so many options that anyone in Emma's position would ask for, she would choose something that wasn't for herself, but to improve the service she provided for him. Other people would have asked for money, possessions, travel, anything that could change their lives. But Emma chose something that would benefit Ethan. "Are you telling me that after saving my life, what you want is to cook better for me?" The incredulity in her voice was undeniable. Emma blushed slightly, but lifted her gaze, looking at him sincerely. Yes, there was something so pure and unpretentious about her answer that Ethan felt a tightness in his chest. He, who was used to demanding and opportunistic people, felt small in the face of that simplicity. "That's right." He cleared his throat, trying not to show the wave of emotion that was running through him. "Search for the course you want. Find the best one, no matter where it is. I'll take care of everything." Emma widened her eyes in surprise. "Mr. Caldwell, that's not necessary. I just want something simple." He held up his hand, interrupting her. "I told you I'd take care of everything. Find the course and tell me how much it costs. And besides," he took out his wallet and pulled out a check, quickly writing out a generous amount and holding it out to Emma. "Use this for anything else you need. Expenses, transportation, whatever you want." Emma hesitated, looking at the check as if it were a precious stone in her hands. "This is too much. I can't accept it." Ethan shook his head, determined. "Yes, you can, and you will." Emma finally took the check, her eyes shining with gratitude, but also with a hint of discomfort. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. I can't thank you enough." Ethan made a vague gesture with his hand, trying to look indifferent. "No need to thank me. You've already done more than I could ask for." For a moment they were both silent, the distant sound of the rain filling the space between them. Then Ethan spoke with a lighter tone. "And when you learn to cook Mexican dishes, I want to be the first to taste them." Emma smiled shyly. "I promise, it will be you." Ethan watched her for a few more seconds before leaving the kitchen, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. There was something about her that moved him in a way he didn't understand, but which made him uneasy. Later, in his room, Ethan stared at the window, watching the rain that was still falling. His thoughts were fixed on Emma, on how she had chosen something so simple and selfless in the face of so many possibilities. He wondered what it was about that woman that made him feel so human again. Meanwhile, in the small staff room, Emma held the check in her hands, her emotions running high. She wasn't used to receiving such generosity, but something inside her told her that Ethan was more than the cold man he appeared to be. That very night, Emma decided she was going to do something special. She would spend the next few days working hard on the course she had enrolled in and planning a perfect Mexican dinner for her boss as a gesture of thanks for the opportunity. After a few days, Emma, sure that she could cook perfectly for her boss, informed him about the dinner, and he decided something unexpected. He wanted Emma to have dinner with him. After Ethan's unusual invitation for her to join him at the table, her first reaction was to refuse. "Mr. Caldwell, I really don't think it's appropriate," she said, looking away, her fingers intertwined as if trying to find a firm grip. Ethan frowned, clearly irritated by her resistance. "Why not? You're already preparing dinner. What would be wrong with enjoying it too?" Emma stammered, trying to find words, but her shyness overwhelmed her. It's just," she lowered her voice, almost to a whisper. "I don't know how to act. I don't even know what to wear." Ethan sighed, rubbing his forehead, as if fighting his own impatience. When he finally answered, his voice had a rare kindness. "Emma, I'm not asking you to parade at a gala event. I just want you to have dinner with me. It'll be a quiet evening, that's all." There was something in his tone that made her hesitate. It wasn't an order, but a request, and that disarmed any argument she might have had. "All right, I'll think about it," she finally said, unaware that Ethan already considered it a victory. Over the next few days, Emma immersed herself in preparing dinner. She spent hours trying out traditional recipes she had learned on the course, testing spices and balancing flavors. The kitchen became her refuge, but also a stage for growing doubts. Every time she thought about the night of the dinner, her heart raced. "Why does he want this?" she asked herself over and over again while stirring the sauces or adjusting the temperature of the oven. She knew that Ethan was a private man, almost unapproachable. So why did he make a point of being there? On the night of dinner, doubt gave way to insecurity. Emma looked in the full-length mirror in her small bedroom and almost gave up again. She had chosen a simple, light blue dress that highlighted her curves in a subtle way, but she felt exposed. "Not good enough," she muttered to herself, running her hands through her hair, which was tied up in a low, unassuming bun. For a moment, she almost changed into something more discreet, but the memory of Ethan's insistence stopped her. He had said he wanted a quiet evening, no expectations, no judgments, and, even without knowing exactly why, Emma decided to trust that. When she appeared in the dining room, the sound of her footsteps echoing softly, Ethan was already at the table. He was wearing an impeccably pressed white shirt and black pants, looking both casual and sophisticated. When he heard the footsteps, he looked up and froze. Emma was beautiful, not the kind of flashy or planned beauty he saw at high society events, but a beauty that seemed natural, as if she needed no effort to be absolutely stunning. The simple dress highlighted her skin, and her eyes shone with a mixture of shyness and determination. "You're," he began, but stopped, realizing that it would sound strange to finish the sentence. Clearing his throat, he continued more neutrally. "Are you ready?" Emma nodded nervously, avoiding his eyes for longer than necessary. "Yes, I hope everything is to your liking." "I'm sure it will be," he said, pulling out a chair for her, a gesture that surprised her, but which she accepted with a slight nod. The table was spotless. Discreet candles illuminated the dishes, highlighting the bright colors of the recipes Emma had prepared with such care. There were tacos, enchiladas, a spicy red sauce and guacamole, as well as a traditional dessert that she had made for the first time. Dinner began with an almost uncomfortable formality. Ethan asked light-hearted questions about the preparation of the dishes, and Emma answered hesitantly, not sure if she was being judged. But as time went by, the barriers began to fall. "It's very good," he said, trying one of the enchiladas, "but this is much spicier than I expected." Emma laughed for the first time that night, a soft sound that caught Ethan's attention. "Oh no, I think I overdid it," she said, putting her hands to her face in embarrassment. "No, no!" He held up his hand, still smiling. "It's perfect. Just, maybe I need more water." They both laughed, and for the first time in Emma's memory, the atmosphere seemed light, almost normal. But with each accidental touch, when the cutlery crossed or when he passed her something and his fingers brushed hers, a different warmth arose between them. There was a subtle tension, an energy that they both felt, but neither dared to acknowledge. When dinner was over, Emma started to get up to collect the plates, but Ethan held up his hand again. "No, leave that for tomorrow." "But, Emma," his voice was firm but not rude, "today is about you. Leave it." She hesitated before sitting down again, feeling strangely comfortable under Ethan's gaze. "Thank you for tonight. It was one of the best dinners I've ever had," he said, with a sincerity that left her speechless. When they finally left, Ethan went to his room, but the dinner still echoed in his mind. The lightness of Emma's smile, the sound of her laughter, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about the recipes, it all haunted him, like a melody he couldn't forget. He threw himself on the bed, staring at the ceiling, as disconnected thoughts consumed him. "Why does she get to me so much?" he asked himself, irritated by his own vulnerability. Ethan knew that something was changing inside him, but it was too early to admit what it was. Meanwhile, Emma was sitting on the edge of her bed, holding her hands together, as if trying to stop them from shaking. Could it be my head, or did he really feel something? She shook her head, laughing at herself. It was impossible. Ethan Caldwell was a billionaire, a man from another world, unreachable. She was just a maid. But deep down, something told her that night, an invisible barrier had been broken. In the days that followed the dinner, the atmosphere in the Caldwell mansion seemed charged with a new, almost electric energy. Ethan tried to concentrate on business, but his mind often returned to the image of Emma that night. The way the blue dress shaped her curves with understated perfection, the sound of her laughter lighting up the dinner, and above all, the brief touches of her hands that sent shocks through his body. As much as he tried to ignore it, something inside him pulsed stronger and stronger. It was a new, uncomfortable and intriguing feeling, like a knot in his stomach that he couldn't get rid of. Emma, for her part, continued her daily chores at the mansion with the same dedication as always, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Every time she crossed paths with Ethan in the corridors or in the kitchen, her heart raced, and her face seemed to heat up as if the very air around him was more intense. One morning, while Ethan was in his office dealing with contracts and spreadsheets, he heard a soft knock on the door. "Come in," he said without lifting his eyes from the documents. When the door opened, the familiar aroma of fresh coffee hit him before he even saw who it was. He looked up to find Emma standing in the doorway, holding a tray with a cup of coffee and a small plate of homemade cookies. "I thought you might like something to accompany your work, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan put down his pen and crossed his arms, studying her carefully. There was something in her posture, the slight tilt of her head, the kindness in her eyes that disarmed him. "Was this your idea?" he asked, accepting the cup with an accidental touch that made his fingers brush hers for an instant. Emma smiled, a shy smile that made Ethan hold his breath for a moment. "I thought you might like it." He brought the cup to his lips and took a sip, closing his eyes for a brief moment to enjoy the taste. "It's perfect, as always." Emma felt her cheeks blush. Something in the tone of his voice seemed more intimate than usual, as if there was a hidden meaning in his words. "I'm glad you liked it," she replied, trying to keep her composure. As she turned to leave, Ethan called out to her again. "Emma." She stopped, her heart already racing before she even turned to him. "Yes, sir." Ethan hesitated for a moment, his eyes analyzing every detail of her, from the way her hair was tied up to the slightly confused expression she displayed. Finally, he said, "You seem to be different lately." Emma frowned in surprise. "Different?" He nodded, a slight smile appearing on his lips. "Yes, more confident perhaps, more radiant." The choice of words took him as much by surprise as it did her. Ethan Caldwell, known for his coolness and control, felt increasingly unable to hide the attraction that was beginning to grow inside him. Emma looked away, laughing nervously. "I think you're imagining things." "Maybe I am," he replied, still with the smile that completely unsettled her. She left quickly, leaving the office with her hands pressed against her chest, trying to calm her heart, which felt like it was about to explode. Later that week, Ethan decided to take a break from work to enjoy the garden, an area of the mansion he rarely visited. The sun was high, and the breeze carried the scent of freshly tended flowers. As he walked along, he spotted Emma on the other side, kneeling in the dirt, tending to one of the rose bushes. He didn't know why his feet had led him to her, but the next thing he knew, he was standing next to her, watching her curiously. "Do you look after the garden too?" he asked, crossing his arms as he watched her. Emma looked up, surprised by his presence. When there's time, yes. I like doing it. Relaxing. Ethan bent down closer to her and picked up one of the roses she had just pruned. It looks like hard work, he commented, gently touching the petals, but the result is beautiful. Emma was silent for a moment, watching him. There was something about the way he spoke, the way he seemed genuinely interested, that made her feel special. Sometimes the hardest thing is what's worth it in the end, she replied, her words carrying a deeper meaning that they both realized. Ethan raised his eyes to her, and for a moment the world seemed to fall silent. There was no wind, no birds singing, just their gaze, locked on something that neither of them could name. He stood up slowly, offering his hand to help her up. When their fingers met, the same wave of electricity ran through them both as on the night of dinner. Emma hesitated, but accepted the gesture, feeling the warmth of his hands. I think I'm going to need your help to learn how to take care of this too, said Ethan, still holding her hand a moment longer than necessary. Emma laughed softly, trying to ease the tension that seemed to fill the space between them. You? I don't know if it suits the garden work. Ethan raised an eyebrow, defiant. Maybe I'll surprise you. Emma felt her face heat up again, and for a moment, Ethan's gaze fell on her lips, but he quickly looked away, controlling himself. Well, if you decide to try, I'll be around. He smiled again, a smile that said much more than any words could. As Emma went back to work, Ethan took a few steps back but couldn't take his eyes off her completely. He was in dangerous territory, and he knew it. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like running away. That night, as he lay in his bed, Ethan stared at the ceiling in his room, his thoughts spinning like a whirlwind. The image of Emma wouldn't leave him alone. The way she laughed, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about simple things. I can't feel this way about her, he thought, trying to convince himself. It's inappropriate. It's wrong. But deep down, he knew it was useless to deny what was growing inside him. On the other side of the mansion, Emma was also awake, hugging her knees as she stared at the window. The stars seemed brighter that night, but the confusion in her chest wouldn't let her appreciate them. Why does he look at me like that? She thought. Why does he make me feel like there's something more? It can't be, it can't be. But like Ethan, Emma felt that something was about to happen, something that neither of them could avoid. The night was heavy, with the rain drumming against the windows of the Caldwell mansion like a restless symphony. The clock chimed almost 10 o'clock, and Emma finished putting away the last of the utensils in the kitchen. The sound of the storm seemed to echo the whirlwind of emotions she had been trying to ignore for weeks. Each encounter with Ethan seemed more intense, and she didn't know if it was her mind playing tricks on her or if something real was happening between them. As she folded the dishcloth, she heard firm footsteps approaching. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway, as always impeccable despite the hour. His serious gaze landed on her, and Emma felt her heart race. Are you finished for the day? He asked, his voice low but clear. Emma nodded a little nervously. Yes, Mr. Caldwell. I was just going to get my things and go home. He looked out of the window, watching the rain that was falling heavily and relentlessly. It's not safe for you to go alone in weather like this. I'll take you. Emma widened her eyes in surprise. No need to bother, sir. I can call a cab. Ethan shook his head, his mind made up. It's no bother. Go on, get your things. With no time to argue, Emma did as he asked. Minutes later, they were both in the car, the sound of the rain drowning out the tense silence that hung between them. Ethan drove attentively, but his eyes occasionally wandered to Emma. She stared out of the window, trying to ignore the heat she felt every time his hands moved on the steering wheel, so close to hers. When they finally arrived at Emma's house, a simple but welcoming building, Ethan parked in front of the small iron gate. He turned off the engine, grabbed an umbrella from the back seat, and got out of the car. Emma opened the door, but before she could get out, Ethan was already beside her, holding the umbrella to protect her. You didn't have to go out in the rain, she said, her voice almost inaudible over the sound of the storm. I won't let you go in alone. That sentence, said so simply, made something inside Emma break. There was a genuine concern in him that completely disarmed her. The two of them walked together to the door of her house. The umbrella was too small to cover both of them properly, and a few drops ran down Ethan's face, highlighting his strong features even more. When they reached the porch, Emma turned to him, not knowing exactly how to thank him. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell, I really do. Ethan took a step closer, his intense gaze locked on hers. Ethan? Emma blinked, confused. What? Call me Ethan? She felt the air get heavier as she heard this. Something in his eyes seemed to strip away all the masks he wore, all the barriers that made him unapproachable. "It's okay, Ethan," she said hesitantly. He took another step forward, so close now that she could feel the warmth emanating from him, even in the cold rain. "Emma," he began, but his voice faltered, as if he didn't know how to continue. She stared at him, her heart racing, each beat seeming louder than the sound of the rain. "What's wrong?" she whispered, feeling his breath so close. For a moment, he hesitated, but then, as if he couldn't help himself, he leaned in and kissed her. The touch was gentle at first, almost like a question, but when Emma didn't pull back, the kiss deepened, full of urgency and pent-up emotion. The rain continued to fall around them, but at that moment, it seemed as if the whole world had stopped. When they finally broke apart, they were both silent, still so close that their breaths mingled. "I," began Ethan, but he didn't know how to continue. He took a step back, running his hand through his wet hair. "I shouldn't have done that." Emma blinked, confused and vulnerable. "Why not?" Ethan looked away, his expression a mixture of regret and desire. "Because it shouldn't have happened." Before Emma could answer, he was already walking back to his car, leaving her on the porch with her heart in pieces. The next morning, Emma arrived at the mansion with a mixture of emotions she couldn't explain. Her chest felt tight, and each step to the front door seemed heavier than the last. When she finally entered, she avoided the main kitchen, fearful of running into Ethan. But inevitably, their paths crossed in the hallway. He was coming out of his office, his eyes heavy with fatigue, and something else she couldn't decipher. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," she said formally, trying to hide her anxiety. Ethan paused, hesitating for a moment. When he answered, his voice was low, almost tense. "Good morning, Emma." They stood there, the silence between them laden with everything they couldn't say. Finally, Ethan took a step closer, but stopped, as if struggling with himself. "About yesterday," he began, his voice breaking. "I need to apologize." Emma felt her heart drop. "Apologize?" "Yes." He ran a hand over the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "I lost control. It's been a long time since I felt like this." Emma clenched her hands, trying to contain the wave of emotions that threatened to overflow. "And why is that bad?" she asked, her voice firmer than she had expected. Ethan stared at her, his eyes showing the internal battle he was fighting. "Because I can't. Not with you." Without further explanation, he turned and walked away, leaving Emma alone in the corridor. As she continued her work, the tension between them seemed to grow with each passing moment. Ethan was visibly upset, and Emma couldn't get the kiss out of her mind. That night, Ethan Caldwell was in his office, surrounded by papers and contracts that should have been his priority. The light from the lamp cast a yellowish glow over the solid wood desk, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't concentrate. His mind was elsewhere, or rather, with someone else. Emma. Ever since the kiss on the rainy night, she hadn't left his thoughts. He relived every detail, the way his lips had met hers, the warmth of her body so close, the way she had looked at him, unafraid but full of emotion. Ethan had spent his days trying to convince himself that it couldn't happen, that he wasn't the man for her, but the more he resisted, the stronger his desire became. He knew he was crossing a dangerous line, but something about Emma attracted him in a way he had never experienced before. She was different, real, intense in a way that no woman he had ever met before was. With a heavy sigh, he pushed the papers aside and stood up. The silence of the mansion was almost oppressive, and he knew he needed to get out of that office before he went mad. As he walked through the corridors towards the kitchen, his hands were stuffed in his pockets and his footsteps echoed on the cold floor. When he arrived, he saw her. Emma was there, as always, but something about the scene took his breath away. She was absent-mindedly organizing the shopping that had arrived, her hair tied up loosely, with a few strands escaping around her face. She was wearing a simple blouse made of light fabric, which fell softly over her body. Without realizing it, she was humming softly, something Ethan couldn't identify, but which seemed to mesmerize him. He stood in the doorway, watching her, until Emma finally noticed him. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, a little surprised, but with a polite smile. "Do you need anything?" Ethan hesitated. He wanted to say no, that he was just there by chance, but the words that came out of his mouth were different. "I just couldn't sleep." Emma tilted her head slightly, as if trying to decipher him. "Perhaps some tea would help. I can prepare something for you." "No, sir." He shook his head, taking a step closer. "That's not what I need." Emma frowned, confused, but felt her heart speed up. Something in Ethan's eyes was different that night. He seemed more vulnerable, more human. "What's going on, Ethan?" she asked in a lower tone, almost a whisper. He took another step, so close now that he could smell her soft perfume. "I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his voice heavy with emotion. Emma held her breath. "That doesn't make sense." "Maybe it doesn't," he said, moving even closer. "But it's true." Her eyes were fixed on his, as if looking for some confirmation, something to tell her that this wasn't a dream. When he raised his hand and touched her face, Emma felt a shiver run through her body. "Emma," he murmured, leaning in. She didn't have time to reply before his lips met hers again. Unlike the first kiss, this one was full of urgency, as if time was an enemy they had to overcome. Ethan's hands ran gently down her arms, grasping her waist and pulling her closer. Emma, for her part, couldn't resist. She was tired of fighting something that seemed inevitable. Her hands ran up his shoulders as the kiss became deeper and more intense. When Ethan finally pulled away, they were both panting. He looked at her, his eyes shining in a way Emma had never seen before. "Come with me," he said, his voice low but firm. Emma hesitated for a moment, but when she saw the sincerity in his eyes, she knew she couldn't say no. They walked up the stairs in silence, the sound of their footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. When they reached Ethan's room, he opened the door and held it for her to pass through. Emma walked in, her heart pounding like never before. The room was exactly as she had imagined, elegant but minimalist, with neutral tones and dark wood furniture. The curtains were ajar, letting in the dim moonlight. Ethan closed the door and approached, stopping in front of her. For a moment, he just watched her, as if trying to memorize every detail. "I don't know how I got here," he said, his voice full of emotion, "but I do know that I don't want to be anywhere else." Emma felt the tears threaten to come. There was something so true in those words that she could hardly believe it. "Ethan," he didn't let her finish. In one smooth movement, he pulled her close again, kissing her with even more passion. They were both lost in that moment, forgetting the world outside, forgetting any doubt or reason. Ethan's touch was firm but careful, as if he wanted to make sure she knew exactly how much she meant to him. His hands explored Emma's every curve with a reverence that made her heart almost explode. Emma, for her part, felt every barrier inside her crumble. She had never felt so wanted, so seen. When they finally lay down, the storm roaring outside seemed like an extension of what they shared. Every touch, every sigh, every look was charged with an intensity that neither of them had experienced before. Later, while Ethan slept beside her, Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind was in chaos. As magical as that moment had been, she knew that tomorrow would bring complications, and Ethan in his sleep finally seemed at peace, but deep down, even unconsciously, he knew that things would never be the same again. The next morning arrived with the first rays of sunshine illuminating Ethan Caldwell's room, but the mood was far from serene. He woke up before Emma, watching her sleep next to him. There was a peace on her face that he wanted to preserve at all costs, but deep down he knew that reality wouldn't be so kind. Ethan stood up, running his hands over his face as he faced the chaos in his mind. He couldn't deny what he felt. Emma wasn't just a passing fancy. She had become part of something much bigger inside him, but the situation was untenable. She couldn't continue to be the maid in his house while he found himself falling in love with her. "I need to sort this out," he thought, determined. But before he could formulate a plan, the tranquility of the morning was shattered by a familiar voice echoing through the mansion. "Ethan, where are you?" "Claire, your ex-wife." Ethan felt his blood boil instantly. Uninvited, Claire had entered the house as if she still had the right to do so. He left the room quickly, closing the door behind him to prevent Claire from seeing Emma, but the woman was already in the living room, dressed impeccably as always, her expression full of disdain. "What are you doing here, Claire?" asked Ethan, his voice low but full of irritation. She crossed her arms, glancing around the mansion. "I've come to collect some things that are still mine, and last time I checked, I don't need your permission for that." "This isn't your house anymore, Claire," he replied, stepping forward. "You can't just walk in whenever you want." Claire laughed, a cold sound that made him clench his fists. "Oh, please, Ethan, don't start with that pose of authority. We all know you like to control everything because it's the only thing you can do." Ethan didn't reply, trying to stay calm. But before he could react, the door to his room opened and Emma appeared, still fixing her hair and blouse. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire looked at Emma, then at Ethan, and a cynical smile spread across her face. "Ah, so that's it," said Claire, her tone full of venom. "You're having an affair with the maid." Emma froze, her face flushing with embarrassment as her eyes searched for a way out, anything that could get her out of this situation. "Claire, this is none of your business," said Ethan, quickly moving closer to shield Emma from his ex-wife's cruel gaze. "It's none of my business?" Claire laughed again, her tone becoming louder and more aggressive. Ethan Caldwell, the cold and sterile billionaire, now sleeping with the maid. That's absolutely pathetic. Emma lowered her gaze, as if Claire's every word was a blow. "Stop it, Claire!" Ethan shouted, losing control. "You have no right to come here and insult anyone." "Insult?" Claire stepped forward, pointing her finger at him. "The truth hurts, doesn't it? You've always wanted to control everything, but at the end of the day, you can't even do something as simple as start a family." The silence that followed was even crueler. Ethan looked like he was about to explode, but before he could say anything, Claire continued, now looking directly at Emma. "I hope you know what you're getting into, darling. He may be rich, but he can't give you anything real. That's not what he's good for." Emma felt a tear run down her cheek before she even realized it. She didn't want to hear anymore. Without saying a word, she turned and hurried down the stairs, the sound of her shoes echoing across the mansion floor. "Emma!" Ethan tried to call out to her, but she was already far away. He turned to Claire, his eyes blazing with anger. "You've crossed the line. Don't come back here again." Claire smiled, satisfied with the damage she had caused. "Good luck trying to fix it, Ethan. You'll need it." And with that, she left, leaving the door open behind her. Emma hurried out of the mansion, her heart heavy as lead. Claire's every word resonated in her mind, and no matter how hard she tried to push them away, they insisted on staying. "He's no good for this." She knew it wasn't true, but the insecurities she had been repressing for weeks were now coming to the surface. What could Ethan really want with someone like her? He was a billionaire, a man used to a world she could never understand. Maybe Claire was right. Maybe it was all a mistake. When she got home, Emma threw herself on the sofa, hugging her knees as the tears finally escaped. At the mansion, Ethan paced back and forth, his mind boiling. He knew Claire had been cruel, but what bothered him most was the impact her words had had on Emma. He needed to make it right. He needed to talk to her, explain everything, show her that nothing Claire had said mattered, but at the same time, a part of him was terrified. What did he really have to offer Emma? What if, deep down, Claire was right? He sat down on the living room sofa, running his hands over his face. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was losing control, not just over the situation, but over himself. And deep down, he knew he had to make a choice before it was too late. The days dragged on in silence for Ethan Caldwell. The mansion, once a symbol of power and control, now seemed an empty, oppressive space. Every room carried a memory of Emma, the soft sound of her laughter, the discreet perfume she left in the air, the moments of exchanged glances, and above all, that last night together. Ever since Emma had left without looking back, Ethan had called her tirelessly, but the calls were never answered. He left short, hesitant messages, trying not to sound desperate, but the truth was that he was completely heartbroken. "Emma, please pick up. We need to talk." Each ignored call was like a blow to his heart. He had never felt this way before. Not like this. The pride that had always protected him was now irrelevant. Emma had broken through his defenses, and he didn't know how to live without her. In her mind, however, things were very different. Emma ignored the calls because she knew that when she heard Ethan's voice, she would give in, and that was what she feared most. Sitting on the sofa in her modest living room, she stared at her cell phone as it vibrated again. It was Ethan. Her heart raced, her hands trembled, but she couldn't answer it. "I can't. He's just using me. He's a rich, powerful man. It could never work." Emma was in love, but the fear of being just a whim in Ethan's life kept her away. And on top of that, there were Claire's cruel words that continued to haunt her. But what she didn't expect was what came next. A few days later, Emma began to feel something strange. At first, it was just mild dizziness. Then nausea set in, to the point where she couldn't keep anything down. At first, she thought it was stress, but when the delay in her cycle became evident, she began to get suspicious. The test in her hands confirmed her suspicions. 2 clear lines, as if shouting the truth that she could hardly believe. Emma was pregnant. She sat up in bed, her heart racing. Tears began to stream down her face as her mind spun in a whirlwind of emotions. How is this possible? He's sterile. Claire's words echoed in his mind. "You're no good." But there it was, proof that something extraordinary had happened. Emma held the test as if it were the most precious thing in the world, but also the most terrifying. How can he believe me? He can barely accept how he feels about me, and now this? For hours, Emma remained motionless, staring into the void, until something inside her changed. She knew she needed to talk to Ethan. He had a right to know, and she couldn't keep running away. At the Caldwell mansion, Ethan was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the phone in silence. With every day that passed without any news from Emma, he felt his desperation growing. He considered going to her house, but feared it would be inappropriate or would drive her further away. The sound of an incoming message interrupted his thoughts. He picked up his cell phone, and when he saw Emma's name on the screen, his heart almost stopped. "I need to talk to you. Can I come over tonight?" For a moment, Ethan couldn't answer. He read and reread the message several times, trying to believe it was real. Finally, he typed quickly, "Sure, I'll be waiting." Relief was accompanied by a wave of anxiety. What did she mean? Why now? He had spent all day imagining 1,000 scenarios, but nothing could prepare him for what was to come. When Emma arrived at the mansion that evening, the rain was falling lightly but steadily, blurring the lights along the way. She got out of the cab with hesitant steps, holding a small umbrella that didn't seem to protect her from the cold she felt inside. Ethan was waiting for her at the door. When he saw her, his heart raced, a mixture of relief and fear. She looked paler, more vulnerable, but she was still the Emma he couldn't get out of his head. "Emma," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. I thought I'd never see you again." She looked away, trying to control the tears that were already threatening to fall. "We need to talk, Ethan." He nodded, stepping aside to let her in. The two of them made their way to the living room, the silence between them so heavy that it seemed to fill the whole room. Ethan gestured for her to sit down, but Emma remained standing, her arms crossed as if trying to protect herself. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to hide his nervousness. "Why have you not spoken to me for so long?" Emma took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. She knew that those words would change everything, but she couldn't put it off any longer. "Ethan," she began, her voice breaking, "I didn't know how to tell you this, but I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan stared at her, his eyebrows drawn together in an expression of surprise and confusion. "Pregnant?" he repeated, as if the words were difficult to process. Emma nodded, her hands trembling as she gripped the hem of her coat. "Yes, but that doesn't make sense." He stood up, running his hands through his hair. "Emma, you know, I can't." He couldn't finish the sentence. Claire's words came back to him, bringing a wave of insecurity and disbelief. "I know what you're thinking," said Emma, her voice shaking, "that it can't be yours, but I haven't been with anyone else, Ethan. Not since that night." Ethan looked at her, trying to find some doubt in her eyes, but all he saw was sincerity. He felt the ground disappear beneath his feet, the world spinning around him. Emma took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears that insisted on falling. "I don't expect you to believe me now, but I needed to tell you. I needed you to know the truth." She paused, her hands pressed together. I'm leaving now. Think about what you want." And before Ethan could reply, Emma began to turn to leave. Emma had barely taken 2 steps towards the door when she felt a firm hand grab her arm. She turned quickly, and there stood Ethan, his eyes shining with something she couldn't define, despair, hope, love. He was panting, as if every second she spent away from him stole the air from his lungs. "Don't go." His voice was low but charged with emotion. Emma stopped, confused and teary-eyed. "Ethan, Before she could finish, he pulled her to him and kissed her intensely. There was no doubt or hesitation in that gesture. It was a kiss full of passion, but also of gratitude, of relief. When their lips parted, Ethan held Emma's face with his hands, his thumbs gently caressing her skin. "I love you, Emma," he said, his voice hoarse but full of certainty. "I didn't know it was possible to feel that, but you've shown me that it is. And now you've given me something I spent my whole life thinking I'd never have." Emma felt tears run down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of relief and happiness. "I love you too, Ethan, but I was so scared, I guess I didn't know how you would react." He shook his head, a smile beginning to appear on his lips. "How could I react any other way? Emma, all I ever wanted was this, a child, a family. You gave it to me. You gave me everything." He hugged her again, pressing her against his chest as if he never wanted to let her go. "We'll get through this together. I'll be by your side, always." Emma hugged him back, feeling all the fear and doubt disappear. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. A few weeks later, Emma and Ethan were in a doctor's surgery, anxiously awaiting their first ultrasound. Ethan held her hand tightly, his anxiety evident. When the doctor entered and began the examination, the silence in the room was broken by the rhythmic sound of heartbeats. "Well, here's the first little heart," said the doctor with a smile. Ethan squeezed Emma's hand, his eyes shining with excitement. "First?" asked Emma, confused. The doctor kept moving the device over Emma's belly and then laughed softly. "Yes, first, because there are two more." The silence in the room was broken by Ethan and Emma reacting simultaneously. "Three?" they exclaimed together, almost incredulous. The doctor nodded, amused. "Yes, triplets. Congratulations." Ethan put his hands to his face, laughing with pure relief and disbelief. He looked at Emma, whose eyes were full of tears but whose smile seemed to light up the whole room. "It's a miracle," she murmured. Ethan held her face again, as he had done that night, and kissed her softly. "It's more than a miracle, Emma. It's the most precious gift I've ever received." Months later, in an intimate ceremony in the garden of the Caldwell mansion, Ethan and Emma were married. The sun shone as if to bless the union, and every detail of the decor seemed to capture the love that overflowed between them. "I promise to love you all the days of my life, Emma," said Ethan, holding her hands as they exchanged vows. "And I promise to give you all the love you deserve, Ethan. You and our children are my life." When they said "I do," the guests applauded. But for Ethan and Emma, at that moment, the world was down to the two of them. Shortly afterwards, the triplets were born. 2 boys and a girl, healthy and with energy to spare. Ethan almost fainted when he saw the 3 of them together for the first time, the little faces that were his perfect image. "They look just like you," said Emma, laughing as she watched Ethan hold the 3 babies in his arms, with a smile that seemed impossible to erase. "I don't know if I can do it," he joked, but his eyes shone with pride. "But with you by my side, Emma, I think I can do anything." The years passed, and the once cold and lonely house was now filled with laughter, love, and the sound of children running down the corridors. Ethan was a devoted father who melted with every smile and word from his children. Emma, on the other hand, was the heart of the family, a loving mother and the light of Ethan's life. The Caldwell mansion, which was once just a symbol of wealth, was now a home. And for Ethan and Emma, there was no greater wealth than the love they shared and the family they built together. They overcame all obstacles, and fate, which had brought their paths together so unexpectedly, gave them the happiest ending they could have imagined. If you like this story and want to see more like it, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so that you receive our exciting stories firsthand. Don't miss the video that's appearing on your screen right now. Click to watch. You'll love this story too.